one of the biggest ego checks you can experience is having the rug pulled out from under you. So let's talk about it. Welcome back to Who is Amanda Jane, where we talk about insights and experiences into the never ending process of self becoming. Um, and I'm Amanda Jane, in case you haven't guessed. And to recap, last time nothing happened because this is the first, technically the first in this iteration of series. So if you're here, congratulations. You've made it to my beginning, which is really kind of the middle, but I digress. I digress. I digress a lot, actually. But anyway, ego checks. Rug pulled out from under you. Let's talk about it. I've experienced this in different forms multiple times. So that's, again, I'm here in part because I've been through it and I'm trying to create something that I would have wanted if if younger me had access to me. So that's where we are. But what I want to talk about today, the specific version of this that I'm going to talk about today, the story I'm going to tell is around um, specifically the type of rug pull that where it's like forces beyond your control, right? So I've experienced this where I was my own worst enemy and kind of self-sabotaged entirely, and the rug was pulled out from under me as a result of that, or that's how it felt. But I've also experienced this where I was just like blind and naive and super green and like wasn't really seeing or recognizing all of the signs, or sort of like, not, I lacked perspective essentially. And that's kind of similar to the other. So that was like, again, it's more of an internal thing versus an external thing. But what I want to talk about today, because I think a lot of people are falling into these waters where you've made your plans, you've done things, and you feel like you're on a good trajectory, and then suddenly, like force majeure happens, something way beyond your control happens and completely upends everything. Um, and and it's not in the like extreme scenarios of necessarily of like natural disaster or war. It's something else, right? Something maybe a step or two down from that, right? And so like not quite so catastrophic, but still impactful. Uh, and that's hard. That's really hard. It's really disorienting. And so let me set the scene. so, so it's the year is 2011. I have been a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras for a year and a half, and I have 8 months left of my service. And I am loving it. I am located in a super small mountain town in the Department of El Paraíso. And so it's green, it's mountainous, it's coffee country, and which I loved. I love coffee culture places. I'm living with a host family who it feels like they've genuinely adopted me. I have a crush on the boy next door. I have a super hot host brother who happens to be married and also has a crush on me. It's very like I have so much material to write my own telenovela. I won't because it's not. That's a different story, but the point is I was like really immersed in the community. I was really active in the community. And for those of you that don't know what Peace Corps is, the Peace Corps is a soft diplomacy program of the United States government where they send usually young people in their 20s, but it's all ages, but they send Americans to do community service in communities around the world. And it's much more about soft diplomacy, which is essentially building good faith and positive relationships between Americans and people and local citizens of foreign countries than it is about doing really impactful aid and development work. It's sort of the aid and development part is a bonus if you can do it, because most of the time, fresh graduates don't always have the hard skills that these communities need. So, for example, I was working with, I was assigned to work with the mayor's office. I was doing sort of municipal development, which was even my recruiter, my Peace Corps recruiter couldn't tell me exactly what that meant. All of that to say, right? So I was, a lot of what the community that I lived in needed was, were like infrastructure, like sustainable and manageable infrastructure projects, um, you know, clean, drinkable water. And they had like, there was different things to do with it, but like clean and potable water wasn't something like the water that we use to wash our clothes and, um, wash things was not the water that we would drink. And so it was different. Right. And, they like, and they needed paved roads, like things like that. So it was things that I did not have the engineering skills. Oh, health, that was the other one. Access to healthcare. There were 2 nurses that lived in the town who were local, and there was 1 doctor who would travel there like a couple days a week, right? And so for the whole municipality, sometimes people would walk, for several hours to get there early in the morning so that to wait in line to be seen. And it's a thing, right? And so like those, like that's what the town, like that's what they really needed. And here I come, a 20-something little white girl who's like, with good intentions. And I had the perspective, I knew that I wasn't what they needed to get, to have any like real impact from a development perspective. And so my goal was to integrate into the community and to figure out what I could do, what was actually within my capacity to do, where they wouldn't be, that wasn't dependent on my staying, or my sort of like ongoing presence, which is ironic given the story that I'm about to tell. But I had good intentions. I was, green, and like the reality is I was not going to change these people's lives, right? In like a in terms of quality of life, substantive kind of way. Relationally, maybe, but like, in terms of their day-to-day existence, probably not so much. So that was a whole little tangent. But so but point is, I'm happy there, and I feel like it's the first time that I've lived in a community-centric culture. And so I was experiencing, and like my brain was rewiring around what it means to be part of a community, how you show up for people, navigating like family and generational dynamics, because I did feel like really adopted into my host family. And so it was really like holding up a lens and a mirror for me in these different ways, these sort of different ways of living and different ways of coexisting, that were really formative for me. And so I was in love with my town, and with the experience, and I felt like I had something to strive for, even if it was imperfect, right? And so I have 8 months left in my service. I had spent like the first year in that town really kind of trying to figure out, like really trying to understand the culture and really trying to understand the dynamics and the people. And being actively involved. And so I really wanted my last 8 months where I could create something that could be something of impact, or that could be something that they could take ownership of, that they would want to take ownership of. Right? That it was sort of actually something that was aligned. So I was really excited to finish my service. And all of the things that I had been planning around, I had planned on extending my service. I was either going to do a service extension and to stay in town for another year or so, because that was an option at the time, or I was going to try to get an internship with USAID, RIP, in the capital city, because they had a special internship for returned Peace Corps volunteers, or figure something else out. And my backup plan was start studying for the GRE and go to grad school. But that was like, that was if by August, the next August, right? Like that sort of, if after that 8 months I didn't have the ability to extend or stay in country. So that was like a 2-year plan. Like the grad school was like for 2 years from now. And so I'm like kicking it. I am excited. I feel like I have all of these different plans and I have my contingency plan. And at that time, as a very sort of type A type of person, and somebody who was anxious without really knowing that I had any real sort of anxiety, I prided myself on being somebody who was reliable, who always was like grounded and put together, and who always had a plan. And so like I was a person where, I thought I was like the unshakable person, right? So that, I had a plan for every contingency. So I had plan A to G, right? Like this is my main plan. If that doesn't work, then I'll do this. If that doesn't work, I'll pivot to this. And if that doesn't work, I'll pivot to that. But for whatever reason, in my, ignorance / naivete, I never in my wildest dreams thought that staying in Honduras wouldn't be an option. So, pause, zoom out, context. So to give some broader context to what was happening at the time that I was aware of, but perhaps not fully grasping on some level, or it was clearer in retrospect is really what the answer is. So in 2009, there was a coup in Honduras where the sitting president, Zelaya, was essentially exiled by the military. And then that following election season in November, a new president was elected. And it's, I won't get into like the geopolitics of all of that. The main point of that for this story is it created kind of that sort of uncertainty and that unexpectedness within the country created a sort of power vacuum and a gap that was quickly filled by primarily organized crime and corruption. And a lot of the organized crime was facilitated or enforced or implemented by two highly established gangs, which were MS-13 and 18th Street Gang. And their main focus, like they were mainly in the major urban areas, so Tegucigalpa, San Pedro Sula, La Ceiba, a couple of others. And so, but there was all sorts of things happening, right? But there was the sort of absence of a sense of cohesion, and people really trying to get their piece of illicit and even legal trades and commerce, and control over different territories, or like influence over different territories. So there's that's a very simplified explanation, but that's just to give you a general sense of what was happening. And so throughout that, Peace Corps kept sending volunteers, right? That didn't stop. That didn't shut Peace Corps down. And so in 2010, my cohort arrives, and we get trained on things like on like personal safety. And so it runs the gamut from like pickpocketing and making sure that we don't get we know which taxis to take, or how to navigate certain taxis, or how to avoid suspicious taxis, because like there's a thing called express kidnapping where you get into a taxi and there's either another passenger, there's usually another passenger who essentially holds you up and takes you to an ATM and and makes you take out money, that kind of a thing. So they're all usually after money. So it's not a super fun experience for the people who've been through that. And so to bus assaults where, it's like essentially highway robbery where a bus gets pulled over in the middle of the road and, thieves come on, and usually they're armed. They're not always, but usually they're armed, and you just hand over your stuff, and usually nothing happens. And then we also got told, like, we also talked about, like, kidnapping, or if someone does try to separate you from the group, all of these things. So, like, this is the, like, security orientation that we're getting as Peace Corps volunteers who are going alone into these communities. And part of the reason, and we're very much taught that the community is our protection, right? Forging positive and supportive connections with the people in our communities is what's going to keep us the safest. And that, I found that to be very true in my experience. I think for some of the volunteers who are in slightly more urban settings, it's a little more challenging, or that can be more challenging. But theoretically, if you have a good relationship with your neighbors and with your community, they look out for you, and you look out for each other. And I found that to be very true for myself. And, and a slight footnote is that Peace Corps' budget was at least, definitely at that time, and probably even still, was no larger than the entire budget of the military band, right? And so, just to give you, it's very much a shoestring operation considering the vast network, and so the resources that they have are very limited. And as Peace Corps volunteers, we were getting paid like a monthly stipend that was equivalent to like the minimum wage in that country. So it's not like we have to kind of operate in this grassroots way. And I think that was, again, this is a total tangent, but I think what was interesting and enlightening for me, again, was, it's a reality check, and it's a perspective shift in terms of what people really have to deal with, especially if you're someone who comes from privilege. And I had, for me, I'm like the type of person, like, these trainings are great. Like, I want to know what to do in these situations, because again, like undiagnosed anxiety, I'm like, yes, please tell me how to do all of the things, so that I can take care of myself and like have control, feel like I have a sense of control in a situation. Meanwhile, I had fellow volunteers who were just like, if this is the risk, then why are we here? Right? So that question was raised when we first got there, by some of my fellow volunteers, right? In terms of like, what are we really getting ourselves into? Is it really this dangerous, or is it really this scary? And again, it varied from person to person. But Peace Corps had all of these different protocols in place around, which bus companies to avoid because they tended to be held up more often, which cities we could visit or not, which hotels or which parts of town we could really be in if we had to go to a city that was considered dangerous, or where security was harder to manage. We had different types of curfews, and we had all of these sort of rules and guidelines and limitations on our movements for our safety. And so if we were going to be out of our town, out of our site, as they called it, where we were living, we had to report that to the main office so that they knew where we were going to be in case something happened, right? So there were all of these protocols in place. There were all of these things. And again, I felt very embraced and protected by my community. I felt really connected to them. And they did look out for me. Like I used to go for runs, and one time I got bored of running around the soccer field, and so I just went for a run on this road, and my entire host family, I didn't see anybody. I didn't see my host family at all. But I got back, and my whole host family had already heard that I had been on that road, and were just like, "Don't do that ever again, Amanda." What if someone tries to kidnap you? And in my mind, I'm like, that wouldn't happen. Everybody's so lovely here, right? But they were like, no, just stick to the soccer field. And so I listened to them, right? And everything was fine. But it was that, so there was that level of community and protection and people looking out for one another. And it was really beautiful. And so anyway, so there was this broader context of, an increase in crime and insecurity in the region and in Honduras in particular as a result of some of the sort of geopolitical dynamics that were happening at that time. Also, context that's important. As I mentioned, Peace Corps' budget is really small, and they were under fire in Congress because specifically around volunteer safety, because there had been an incident in one of the West African countries where that ended up in a volunteer being murdered. It was very tragic. It was very awful. And it was something that I don't know could have been easily foreseen, but I think it was something that may have been preventable, right? It's hard to say. But all of that to say is that incident raised a lot of flags around Peace Corps volunteer safety with how Peace Corps was managed. And so Peace Corps is sort of like already operating on a really limited budget. They don't have a lot of resources to, protect volunteers or to insulate volunteers from certain risks or realities or threats. And so they were hypersensitive at this point, at this time in history, to perceptions of volunteer safety and reports of volunteer safety. So pause, unpause. Let's zoom back in. So now we're back in December 2011. I'm in my site. I'm loving it. I'm planning for my next 8 months. And I'm about to go on like a 2-week vacation right before Christmas with one of my friends, Nuzat. Hi, Nuzat. I miss you. And have a really great time. And I don't remember what the exact timing was, but right around that time, like right before I was about to pick up my friend from the airport, essentially, we got word that a volunteer had been seriously injured in a bus assault. And so it was the first, basically what happened was this volunteer was heading back to their site after attending like a work conference for their project that they were working on. And it was like 1 p.m. on a Sunday, and they had followed every single safety protocol there was. Like they didn't do anything wrong. And there's really no fault. This was a very much a wrong place, wrong time, bad luck situation, where their bus was stopped and armed robbers came on, and one of the other passengers, was saying not today, pulled out his gun, shot in the bus. Everybody's still in the bus. He shot at one of the robbers, which started a shootout on the bus. And so people got caught in the crossfire, and that volunteer was one of them. They got shot in the leg, and it was non-fatal. They survived. But it was a shock to everybody that had happened. And it was also not surprising, right? Like it was one of those, on some level it felt inevitable, because there were so many other things that had been happening, or that other volunteers I knew had experienced, where there were a lot of close calls, or there was sort of like inevitable that a wrong place, wrong time situation was going to end badly for a volunteer. And I can say that now and hear myself saying that, but at the time, me living there and being so immersed and feeling so connected to my community, and wanting to kind of see some things through and extend my stay, it was sort of like we know the risk. It's like we're risk aware. We know the risks. We know this might happen. It's awful and it's scary. But so many things have happened, and Peace Corps has never, so many uncertain and tumultuous things have happened in the history of, Peace Corps in Honduras, and they've never shut down. It's one of the it was at the time it was one of the first Peace Corps countries, right? And so Peace Corps had been there for forever, for decades. And so it was sort of this isn't gonna close up shop, right? I don't think new volunteers should be sent. But, those of us who are already here will get to finish our service, right? Like that was my assumption. I truly believed that even after that incident. But sure enough, maybe about 2 weeks after that, we were given the order to shelter in place, which meant we couldn't leave our site, and to prepare to evacuate in 2 weeks. And I was shocked. Like that felt like the rug being pulled out from under me. And so, it might not seem like it as I'm telling it to you because I have all of this retrospect. I'm telling you from a place of past, of being able to look backward. But at the time, I was so angry and I was so shocked. And I was angry at the circumstances. I was angry that, that the context was what it was, and that it removed any choice I had or I felt that I had. And so, when in this situation, my choices were I could leave. So after receiving the shelter in place and evacuation order, I could leave now and essentially resign from Peace Corps early, and that would limit the readjustment benefit. So Peace Corps would offer, because we're not earning a whole lot of money, they would basically give you like a small stipend to cover the first, 1 to 3 months of living expenses when you return to the U.S. Until you got a job, and they would help you. They also offered vouchers to visit a therapist and a dentist and a doctor or whatever for any sort of immediate healthcare needs or checkups that you might want or need to do until you got a job and got insured. You know what I mean? So they had a sort of adjustment period where they would give a certain level of support to help volunteers go from being, in country, living on minimum wage for that particular country to U.S. life and the U.S. culture. So if you terminated early, you didn't get the full scope of those benefits if you resigned, essentially. I could say fuck you to the system and stay in my site as I really wanted to, but if I did that, I would lose all of the benefits. There would be no benefits whatsoever. So I wouldn't get I would forfeit all of the readjustment benefits when I eventually did return to the United States. I would lose my visa sponsorship. I wouldn't have an income because I wouldn't be getting the stipend from Peace Corps. So I'd essentially be, overstaying my visa and having to find a job if I chose to stay. And while, again, my community was amazing, and I had friends who ran a pulperia, which is like a sort of convenience store in the town, and they were and they had told me, I think even before then or at some point, Amanda, if you ever can't afford anything, don't worry about it, we got you, which was really nice and endearing. But again, I wasn't fully, I was still in the early stages of understanding the full scope of what it meant to be privileged, or the sort of politics of my own identity. But I was aware enough that I was I don't, that is very generous. And if I ever really, really need it, then I might take them up on it. But I was I wasn't about to not pay or not contribute. You know what I mean? And so the point of that is there were people in my community who were willing to support me, but I knew, and just for my own ethics and, moral, ethical dilemma, I knew that if I had stayed, or if I tried to stay and take that risk, that it would be more of a burden, right? Because I wouldn't have an income to contribute to help offset the costs of supporting me. I wouldn't be able to support myself. And while that might have been fine for, a month or two, there was so much uncertainty at that point in time, and I had no idea what I could do or what could be done or how this evacuation would affect, employment. Because there was when we got the evacuation order, there was sort of an open-ended question of, but is this like a permanent evacuation or is this temporary? And we were told to act like it was permanent, but it wasn't set in stone that it was permanent, right? And so it was this weird, there was this weird hope of well, maybe I'll get to come back anyway, or maybe it'll just be a month or two and I'll get to come back. And so there was so much uncertainty around what it meant to stay. And I had family calling me being like, you need to get on a plane right now. You need to get on a plane yesterday, because they were panicking. And worried, and they were mad at me for not immediately jumping on a plane to leave, because they didn't have the perspective that I had. They hadn't spent the past year and a half living life in that country and in that context. And so I ended up, so the long story short story long, I chose to evacuate and do all of the things, but I was completely heartbroken, because in my mind there were two things that were challenging my ego. One was, there's more to it, but on the ego check level, one was my self-concept as a planner and as somebody who doesn't get shaken and who's prepared for anything. And I wasn't prepared for this. And so from an existential standpoint, it felt like I had made a mistake, right? And I had done something wrong, because I didn't plan for this. And it made me feel like I was breaking promises. It made me feel like I was failing on some level, right? Or that I was dumb, there was a lot of those types of stories that were surfacing as a result of that. And it was an ego check in the sense of recognizing that there's things that I can't control, right? I can't control what other people are doing. I can't control the geopolitical context. I can't control that, the Peace Corps administration in DC has different information and has limited information and is fighting, battles on multiple fronts to protect all volunteers across the world. And so, there's hard decisions that had to be made, and I don't get a say in that. I don't have a voice in that. I didn't get a choice, right? And so, what do you mean I don't get a choice? What do you mean I have to just comply, right? What does that mean? This is stupid. I get it now in retrospect, why that decision was made, and I don't know that I would have made a different decision if I was an administrator in that position, but it just felt so wrong. And that was the other, I don't know how much of this was an ego check, but it was very much a reality check around privilege and exceptionalism. You know what I mean? So, or maybe you don't know what I mean, but what I mean by that is nothing had changed in Honduras, right? It wasn't suddenly things were getting more violent, right? That reality of bus assaults and crime and safety concerns had been the same, essentially, the entire time that my cohort and I had been in Honduras, if not before then. And so it wasn't there was this freak accident or unexpected thing or unusual thing that happened that was different. It's just, this was the first time that a volunteer was seriously injured. It's not the first time a volunteer could have been killed. There were other incidences where there were really close calls, but the volunteer was unharmed and either didn't report or it wasn't because of that, it was sort of It wasn't raised, it wasn't elevated, it didn't escalate the concern or the security concerns for the whole, as for the volunteers as a whole, maybe just that one volunteer, right? And it was like an evidence of, wrong place, wrong time, that is unpredictable, and that like all of the safety protocols in the world cannot protect people from, right? And so for me, it was like nothing changed. So why does it now suddenly mean that we all have to leave? Right? Like why isn't there more of like a participatory discussion on this in terms of getting to stay versus getting to leave? And in fairness, I remember taking some sort of survey, but I can't remember when that happened. So, and I think it was before that incident. But there was a lot of debate even among volunteers. But I was very much of the group where I was like, I think those of us who are in communities that are safe and that feel safe, and who are more than halfway through our service should get the choice to finish our service. And I think everybody else who wants to leave should get the chance to leave without consequence, because they might not be in as safe a setting, or they might not feel as safe. And I don't think there should be new volunteers sent, but I thought that option would be available to me, and it wasn't. And that felt so disempowering. And then facing the reality of talking to the people in my community who I had grown so attached to, and telling them that I had to leave sooner than expected because of this situation, which to them, was awful. Like, they didn't like the situation, but again, it wasn't like anything had changed. Like, it was still all of our normal, and so it just felt like abandonment. You know what I mean? Like, I was abandoning them. I don't think, in retrospect and with perspective that I have now, they knew I was never going to stay forever, right? Like, they knew I was eventually going to leave. So, whether I left 8 months early or a year or two later, like, they knew eventually I was going to leave. And so I think they were disappointed, but it wasn't as much of a shock to them. You know what I mean? Like, they're used to people coming and going, and they weren't expecting me to stay. But me, as, in my 23-year-old brain, was having this crisis and this, attachment bond trauma, because I had never experienced this before, and I had never been through this kind of separation before, and I had never experienced community and connection like I had when I was there. Right? Like, my identity and my sense of self and my sense of purpose had all become so deeply entwined with being a part of that community. But in a way that wasn't like, but I was still an outsider. You know what I mean? So it's complicated. But all of that to say, like, that's a shock, right? And that's a lot to have to navigate and have to handle. So anyway, so I evacuated. It was awful. I cried a lot. And I had a lot of anger and resentment and guilt and shame and confusion and, like, existential confusion, because I was like, what am I even doing in this kind of industry? If, like, to me, it was like, I don't want to ever be in a position like that where I am ingrained or embedded in a community trying to do something, or where I might even be leading a project where I could be pulled out at the drop of a hat because the powers that be beyond my control, for whether it's a political reason or whether it's a safety reason or whatever, which is usually, I feel like in this case, it's kind of both, right? It's a political and safety reason. Like, the threat to safety has political implications. Right? And so it's all very political. And so I didn't want to be in a position where I didn't get to choose, or where my lack of choice or my lack of control could potentially harm or negatively affect what a community or people that I cared about. You know what I mean? Where they would be left hanging in some way. Um, and again, like, what I was doing was not that serious. It was not something that was like pivotal or critical to that. I'm not trying to say that as a Peace Corps volunteer I was that important. I wasn't. But again, in terms of thinking about like and thank God, because that happened, right? Like, if I had been more important or more critical, or at a really important juncture, that would have been even more harmful. And that's what I was worried about, like that. So that was something that I was worried about in terms of, entering the world of international humanitarian assistance. As a person who comes from a blue passport country, I mean, I don't know if that really, but basically, who has the passport that I have, or had, and especially, and this is in Barack Obama's America, by the way, which, still very imperfect, still very much empire, but sentiment at the time was different. And so all of that to say, I essentially moved back to my parents' house. They were living in Colorado at the time. I did not grow up in Colorado. So it was this like extremely jarring experience where I had gone from being part of a community and having like a sense of community and a sense of camaraderie and having confidants and people that I could talk to and connect with every day, or people I could just visit if I was feeling bored or sad, or if I had a question that needed answering, right? If I just wanted to talk and socialize, to being in the mountains on the outskirts of a really small mountain town, where I didn't know anybody. And, and I had my parents, but, we have a complicated relationship. It's generally good, but it's not the same. And so I felt so lonely and so isolated and so in shock, because, again, everything I thought that I was doing and building, and everything that I thought that I was working towards, and all of my goals were just completely, eviscerated. That's how it felt. And so and I did that for like 5 months until I decided that I just had to, suck it up and move to a city where where I had better job prospects, and start over in a way. And so I did. I ended up moving back to Washington, D.C., because that's where all of the jobs were that I was interested in and was a candidate for. And ended up doing a temp to hire position at the Pan American Health Organization, and worked there for about a year. And to my surprise, so I had applied for that internship with USAID, may it rest in peace. And I didn't get it that first year. And then a year later, I got a surprise, unexpected email from them saying, hey, we're, it's time, we're doing another round of internship applications, and you were shortlisted last time, so if you want it, it's yours. You don't even have to apply. And so it was just this like big shock, and I was able to go back to Honduras for 2 more years. And so I eventually, like, it's this weird roundabout way where eventually, like, my goal was met, but it didn't happen how I expected it to. It was extremely shocking and traumatizing to think that I had completely missed out or failed or lost any of that opportunity to return, or like didn't know how it was going to happen, right? And so that's, partly a lesson in life works in mysterious ways, or if there's something that you really want to do, It doesn't mean it's never going to happen. It just might take longer, and you might have to take a really long detour to, or maybe not so long, in the context now. I don't know that a year is all that long, or the 2 years really. It's like a 1.5 to 2 year gap, I guess. But yeah, like it still happens. It still can happen, if you want it and if you work towards it. And in the meantime, it's being present, and it's also learning to let go of and grieve, and like give space to grieve and mourn, but like learning to let go of the life you thought you were going to have, or the fantasy, and accepting a reality. And that's not always fun, and that's not always easy. And I think, but it's a great opportunity to peel back a layer and go deeper. So, I could have taken the route of, after that whole experience of, no, I just got to become a better planner, and I have to, be even more organized, and, or I have to completely abandon this career option, or whatever it is. I could have taken it to an extreme and gone completely avoidant, or sort of doubled down on the behaviors or the mentality that I had going into that experience. But, and I wouldn't say that it was I didn't do that entirely. There was I did that on some level, I think. Still, it took some time for me to work through that. It wasn't immediate. But I did really take the time, especially in it's sort of forced isolation, right? To really sit with, what was it I was really, what was I expecting, and why did I expect that? And who am I to expect that, right? And what do I actually have control over? And how can I, knowing what I know now from that experience, and all of the potential harms and the risks, to not just to myself but to others, where do I fit within that kind of system? Where do I fit in the world that I want to see, right? And so that planted a seed that I think is starting to grow now, with what I'm doing outside of the system, to an extent, to as much outside of the system that you can really exist, without going completely off grid. But I'm still part of the system, guys. I'm not I don't have a magic, I don't have any magic escape routes or anything like that. But I ended up staying within the system for a while. But it really planted that seed of, there's the question of, if these are my values and my principles, and if these are the potential risks and harms and consequences of a system, or of having to operate in the way that I was taught or socially conditioned to believe I had to operate, to do that, to enforce, or to be able to share or work towards my values, or work in alignment with those values. What does that look like? And where can I actually fit within that system, where I'm not having moral dilemmas, or where I'm not put in this precarious position where I am being told to do something, or expected to do something, or forced to do something, coerced into doing something that I fundamentally don't agree with from an ethical perspective, right? And again, I'm not saying that's what happened with the Peace Corps, but it raised that question for the future, because there are things, there are things that are going to happen like that, or there are situations or jobs that I could have taken, where, again, because of the politics of my identity, it's, or certain aspects of my identity, not my whole identity, but because of the different politics of some of the identities that I hold, and especially if I'm in a role that sort of is contingent on me having those identities, right? So if it is a U.S. government job, if it is about, what I look like or where I come from or what my legal status is. You know what I mean? Like those are the things that reinforce the politicization of whatever it is that I'm doing. And so it creates that question, like, where is this a system that I can be a part of? And if I can, or if there is a place for me in that system to affect change or to be able to ensure that I have, like, what I do have control over is going to be in alignment, and that I can release or, detach from the things I don't have control over without reinforcing harm, great. And so that's part of what my trajectory was, and I explored those different avenues. And then it became also the question of, it was sort of coupled with that question of, what is the world that I want to live in? What does that actually look like? And let's, and sort of like blank slate it, right? Like if all of these systems and structures didn't exist, how could that world function in a way that reinforced, the sort of values and principles of our shared humanity, and honoring the humanity in other people, and, wanting to create a happy, more harmonious world, right? It won't be absent of conflict, but in a world where we can manage conflict or navigate conflict and repair conflict without perpetuating or further, escalating it. So what does that world look like? It's sort of it's a miracle question. It's a fantasy question. And so that's something that I've sat with over the years, and I continue to sit with that because it's always evolving, and my perspective is always evolving, and your perspective is always going to be evolving, right? And so, that's the other question that I started to ask myself at that time, in terms of what could I do, with the skills that I have, or with the knowledge that I have, and what is it that I want to do, and what are the skills that I need, or what are the sort of spaces that I need to connect with to be able to build and create towards that kind of world. And again, I don't have a lot of answers, and we'll get into this in other videos, but there's so many different layers of my own identities and experiences and perceptions and perspectives that I have to deconstruct and reconstruct, and explore and unfold and, evolve. And it's ongoing. It's never ending, right? It's always ongoing. And so there might be a general vision or idea or goal that is really clear to me, which is, like a healthier, more harmonious world. But how that's defined and what that looks like is going to shift and evolve as I continue to learn, as I continue to interact with other people, as I experience life and myself, and in terms of what I actually have to contribute or how I can contribute to that. And so these are the questions that I asked myself, and I share this experience and I share this story as an offering of questions or ways that you can, like a lens that you can use for your own experience if you're in a position where the rug has been pulled out from under you and everything feels uncertain, and everything you thought you were, or everything you thought you were doing, is called into question, and it feels like, an ending, or it feels like a catastrophe. And that is fertile ground for reconstruction, or just construction and creation in general, right? Creation comes bred from destruction. And so I don't think you should just destroy things for the sake of destroying them, or without any clear intention or thoughtfulness behind it, because that can be really harmful in a lot of ways. That can cause more damage than it's worth. And there are ways to deconstruct something, or to, if something does get destroyed beyond your, through situations beyond your control, there's a lot of opportunity to create from that place of like, let's refresh, let's look at what are the things that we really do want to take with us, what are the things that we've learned, what are the things that were working, what are the things that made whatever was broken worth holding on to, and how can we, pour gold into the cracks in a way that makes it even more beautiful, or even like an entirely different, maybe even piece or experience or, space, community, whatever it is. How can we create an offering, or how can we create something that expands on that beauty, if not adds to it, and maybe it creates a whole new image. Maybe it's a mosaic, right? From a broken vase. It doesn't have to be the same exact thing, and it doesn't mean that you throw out all of the pieces and just start from scratch. It's about interrogating and really sitting with and peeling back the layers of what's worth keeping and why, and what is worth creating or adding or integrating into, the things that you want to care. What are the new things that are worth the new growth that's worth integrating into this mess? And how can we create a beautiful food forest or garden from that? Like, there's a lot of opportunity in it, and it doesn't make the grief go away. But it's a matter of, I would say, don't deny your grief. Don't repress the grief of what was lost, or what you thought, like the dream deferred, or the shattered future, or whatever it is. Allow yourself the time and space to grieve it, and accept that grief is going to come up repeatedly. Grief is not a linear process. And take the time to really sit in the destruction and play with your perspective. Like, look at it from different angles, and sit with yourself and look at yourself from different angles. And slowly but surely, as you kind of play with your perspective and, kind of sit with it, instead of trying to just move past it, or, brush it under the rug, or, quickly try to fix it or recreate what was just broken. Just sit with it. Like, be a little still, pause, embrace the pause. And that might, like, a new image might start to emerge, right? You might see the pieces of a puzzle that can fit together differently and create something beautiful, right? Just as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than whatever was broken. I'm speaking in a lot of abstract terms, or sort of euphemistically, I think, but and that's because this can relate to anything from, a relationship that, where like a divorce, or someone dies unexpectedly. And it's tragic and it's awful, and everything, the future that you thought you were building with that person is completely eviscerated. So it can be on that sort of relational or like deeply personal level. It can be about your career. It can be about your community. It can be about, the global situation as it stands, right? So it can go from as macro to as micro a situation. This applies, right? And so it's really up for you to determine what aspect of your life this is resonating with, or what is coming forward for you in terms of how you're thinking about this, or what questions are already there. Because if what I'm saying is speaking to you and is resonating in a particular area, it's because you already have questions there. It's because there's something there that wants your attention. And so give it that attention and see what happens. So that's this episode of Who is Amanda Jane. Please interact with this video, like, comment, subscribe, so that we can find each other again in the world of algorithms. And you can also, I have like a sort of guided quest. I have a free iteration of it, and then I have a sort of workbook that you could purchase. But you can check all of that out on my website. You can sign up for the mailing list. I promise I don't spam you. Like there's the quest, and then I kind of leave you alone. So until there's updates or something really worth mentioning to you. But please check it out if that's something that speaks to you. I've designed it for people who are kind of in this existential, uncertain situation where they're questioning their identity and where they want to go and what they want to do, or how they want to do what they want to do, or how they want to express themselves. So check it out, and I will stay tuned until next time.